Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to Summer University 2014. My name is Kyle Reyes and I'll be the MC just for this morning and the afternoon sessions. We're so grateful that you came out today, and we'll be doing a bunch of thank yous tomorrow at lunch after the service project, so we'll save some of those. But we do have a few announcements for today before we turn the time over to our amazing keynote speaker. First of all, thanks to all those who participated in and especially planned last night's family fun activity. Word on the street is that about 700 to 800 meals were served. Some students were able to come and join in on the fun, so anytime we can support student nutrition, we want to do that. So again, those that attended, those that planned it, it was a great success. I think a few people saw Frozen for the 17th time, so that was nice. And some others saw Ender's Game. So thanks again. Also, thanks to all those who may have participated in the workshops yesterday. This year, there were some changes to Summer University, and the committee decided to have a lot of the sort of personal enrichment workshops on Monday and focus today's activities and today's workshops on professional development. And so those who put on the workshops yesterday, those who participated in them, thank you so much. After Dan Fairbanks presents this morning, the sessions will start right after at 9:40. So again, as soon as we're done here, please make your way to some of the sessions found in your program. Each facilitator at every session will have raffle cards. Please fill out and return the cards to the facilitator of your session so your name can be entered into the prize drawings to be announced on Wednesday. And again, these are amazing prizes. We'll give a shout out to the bookstore and others who have put together these prizes, so thank you. For those who paid for lunch today, it will be served in the Student Life and Wellness Building courtyard, the new courtyard where we had the family event last night. So it won't be in the Waterfall Quad courtyard, it'll be the new courtyard for lunch. Our afternoon keynote speaker, Chris Clark, will be at 1:15 right here in the ballroom, with afternoon sessions starting right after at 2:30. And again, a reminder about service projects tomorrow morning. Some emails should have been sent out giving specific instructions for what you signed up for, as well as we invite you to wear your UVU green shirts. Some of you are wearing them today. Wonderful. We hope that tomorrow as we serve our community, we can blitz our community with UVU green. With that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning to open our 2014 Summer University. Let me read the official stuff and then let me get personal for just a second here about Dan. Dr. Daniel Fairbanks is the Dean of the College of Science and Health and Professor of Biology at Utah Valley University. A renowned expert in genetics, evolution, and international scientific development, Fairbanks is also a trained artist known for his innovative approach to combining art and science by sculpting busts of famous figures in science and history as he lectures on topics related to their areas of expertise. Prior to joining UVU in 2009, Dr. Fairbanks was the head of the Department of Plant, Soil, and Insect Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He previously taught at Brigham Young University and Southern Virginia University and was a Fulbright professor at Universidade Estadual de Londrina de Brazil. Is that
good enough?
Thank you. Fairbanks has published 3 books on genetics and evolution, and his research has been published in scholarly journals worldwide. On a more personal note, let me just say that Dan is a first-rate and world-renowned scholar and artist. It's remarkable that we've had the chance to travel with the president to various locations for both fundraising, alumni opportunities, and Dan has accompanied President Holland on a number of these events. And in those events, people all over the nation, and even though I haven't witnessed it, I've heard accounts of people all over the world recognize his sculpting, recognize his work in his scholarly fields of expertise, but also recognize Dan to be a true gentleman. And so if you can add on that, a gentleman and scholar and an artist, in the words of President Holland, it's sickening how talented he is. A true Renaissance man for our day. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Fairbanks.
It's a great pleasure to join you this morning to do one of these demonstrations. This one is going to be a little different than some of the others that I've done. Usually I'll often do a portrait of somebody, and oftentimes with President Holland speaking, and it's a little bit easier when he's speaking and all I have to do is sculpture, but with these sorts of presentations I have to speak and sculpt at the same time. So what I'm going to present today is an example of what in my mind has to be some of the most fun research I've ever done. I'm going to be reconstructing the face of the priestess of Chortlenkop, who was a priestess who lived in Peru about 800 years ago. I had the privilege of going with Hagen Klaus. Many of you may remember him. He was a professor here at UVU who was in the Department of Behavioral Sciences and is a biological anthropologist. And he and I were able to travel to Peru to the site where the remains of this priestess were being excavated. And before doing that, I was able to do a workshop at the Center for American Sculpture on forensic facial reconstruction, which is what I'm going to demonstrate now. Now, of course, there's only an hour available today, and typically when I do one of these restorations professionally, this particular one took about 3 months to complete. Well, we're going to complete it in an hour here, but it will be, because of that, it'll just be a very brief sketch. But nonetheless, what these reconstructions do, they're used both for criminal purposes, although in the case that I'm going to be demonstrating here, it will be for reconstructing what the face of an individual looked like, in this case, an individual who lived 800 years ago. And we do so by adding all of the muscles, and then muscles, tendons, ligaments, and then putting the skin over the top of it so that it shows what the individual is like. And where we do these in criminal cases, it's really remarkable to compare the reconstructed individual or reconstructed face with the photographs of the individual, because the skull really does determine very much what our features look like. And so we can be fairly confident that this will give us a fairly good indication of what that individual looked like. Well, anyway, I was able to travel to Peru, and I was there at the time when the remains of this priestess were being excavated, and they delivered to me the fragments of her skull. She was buried with 5 other individuals who committed ritual suicide to be with her when she was buried. And they were buried in a seated position, and over time, as her body decomposed, the bones were fragmented and fell on top of one another. And so I had to take this very fragile skull, take the fragments of it, replicate them so that they were exact copies of the fragments, and then reassemble those fragments to reassemble her skull. And what you see in front of you here is a polyester resin cast of the actual skull. Now, we weren't able to get all of the fragments, but fortunately we were able to recover enough. This whole part of the cranium right here, this side right here of the mandible coming around, and then all of this part of the maxilla were intact. And the nice thing about that is that gave me this side right here to replicate with kind of a mirror image, this one. Same thing with the mandible, and then the cranium was fully intact. And so we can be quite confident that this is what her skull looked like before it became fragmented. Anyway, let me describe a little bit about what I'm doing here. I'm adding in what's called the temporalis muscle, which is a muscle that fills in this little bit of a cavity on the side of your skull. And if you want to feel that muscle, it's kind of fun to watch everybody in the audience put their hands up as we do this. If you want to feel that muscle, you can put your hands just in front and just a little bit above your ears, and then move your jawbone up and down. and you can feel that muscle acting. What it does is it attaches up to the top of the skull here, and then it goes underneath this bone, which is the zygomatic arch, and then comes down below that and attaches to the jawbone underneath. And that's one of several muscles that allow you to move your jawbone up and down. But what it also does is it fills in the skull up here and sort of rounds it out. So I'll do the same thing on the other side, where we'll add in this same temporalis muscle. And while I'm doing that, let me tell you just a little bit about what we know of this priestess. She was part of what was called the Moche civilization, living in, when we think of Peru, an ancient people, we usually think of the Inca who lived in the Andes Mountains. But this was a different, very large civilization that lived in the coastal region of Peru, going all the way from the southern part of the country up into Ecuador. There are remains of these civilizations all the way up and down the coast. And this particular civilization lived in the northern part, near the modern city of Chiclayo, which has about 1 million people in it. And the pyramids that they built were made of adobe. And unlike the Egyptian pyramids, these were not chambered pyramids, they were solid. They would build them with adobe brick and then fill them with mostly a lot of their garbage. They used a lot of pottery, and whenever pottery would break, they'd save the broken pieces to fill the interior of the pyramids. And then also they ate a lot of shellfish from the ocean, and then they would save the shells and fill these pyramids. Well, today the pyramids, because they're built of adobe, have eroded somewhat, and so in a few places they've breached, and this garbage has spilled out. And so as we were walking around the pyramids, I recall one day, just looking down and seeing literally millions of pottery shards, some of them with elaborate painting on them. And it was very tempting to just pick one up and stick it in my pocket and take it home as a souvenir. I could have ended up in a Peruvian prison had I done so. But nonetheless, just abundant artifacts that are everywhere. Well, when they discovered her tomb, unfortunately many of the tombs have been looted over time, but hers was one that had been left undiscovered, and as a consequence was full of the riches that were buried with her. She was part of what was called the late Moche civilization, which during those late years, all of the information from excavations indicate that that period of time, women were the rulers, not men. And so she was very likely the ruler of her people. And she, as a consequence, it was obvious that she was very much revered both by her people as well as by people from far away. Within her tomb were offerings that came from northern Ecuador, as well as offerings that came from the high Andes. That is, they were artifacts or little pieces of sculpture and pottery that was typical of civilizations that lived some distance, which indicates how important she was over a very widespread region. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about the anatomy. I'm now adding in what are called the masseter muscles. This is, by the way, in terms of size, this is the strongest muscle in your body. It also helps to move the jawbone up and down, and allows you to bite and to chew very, very readily. So anyway, here are the masseter muscles added in there, and they help to fill in part of the cheek. Okay, a little more about her. She was buried with an enormous amount of elaborate artifacts. Among them When the tomb was first being excavated, she was covered by what had been a large cloth. Now the fabric of that cloth had deteriorated, but sewn into it were a series of copper medallions, probably about 40 to 50 of them that were in a pattern. These were all medallions about 3 inches in diameter that were covering her. On her head was a crown. The crown had deteriorated away. We have a pretty good idea of what it looked like, and you'll see a little bit later I've made a reconstruction of her crown that you'll see. And then she had a copper mask that was covering her face. And the skull itself, when I was working from it, it had this red substance on it, and it was obvious that they had smeared a red pigment on her skin at the time of her death. The red pigment is a substance called cinnabar, which is a mercury compound that is a very bright red, but nonetheless very toxic. And so as we were handling the skull, had to do so with gloved hands and be completely protected so that we could protect ourselves from the cinnabar. Okay, back to the anatomy a little bit. I've just put in what's called the frontalis muscle, which is what allows you to do this sort of thing, raise your eyebrows up and down. And what I'm going to do next is to begin adding in some of the muscles around the eyes. Before doing so, I'm going to fill in the area here. I'm going to adjust these eyes just a bit and check. When you're doing the eyes, when we do facial reconstruction, we want to make sure that the cornea is about what we call tangent with the orbits of the eyes to make sure that they're about the right distance out. And then I'm going to fill in the sockets here a bit and then add in some of the muscles around them. And let me tell you a little bit about the muscles I'm going to add. They will be going around the eye, we have what's called the orbicularis oculi, which are one of the nice things about muscles, when students are learning anatomy, it's they learn that the muscles themselves often describe where the muscle is and what it does. And so orbicularis would indicate what? Well, it orbits around. And that's what these muscles I'm going to add in here will do, is that they do make an orbit, or they go around the eyes. And so for that reason, we call them orbicularis, and in this case, oculi, because they go around the eyes. A little bit later, I'll add in another orbicularis muscle, which is the orbicularis oris. And oris comes from the same root as oral, or the mouth. And so orbicularis oris goes around the mouth, and we'll see that one shortly. All right, while I'm doing this part on the eyes, let me return to talking a little bit about the priestess and what she was like. Anyway, as they were doing the excavations, found this a crown around her head, a copper mask that covered her face. And then below that, she wore a large pectoral necklace. In fact, she actually wore 3 of them. The one that was underneath was made of very small beads. And during the time that we were there, they were able to take these beads. They were still intact enough where they had kind of fallen apart as she was, as her remains were being excavated, that they were able to document where each bead was and restring the necklace and find what the pattern in it was like. And so they were able to recover this necklace from her. And then also she had on either side of the skull were these gold ear spools, which I brought along some replicas that I made of them. They looked about like this and were this size. And on the backs of them, they had these small cylinders that were. It was quite obvious that her earlobes had been gauged and stretched to make holes in them that were about probably about 1.5 inches in diameter, and then these solid gold ear spools were placed in them. And I recall very distinctly as they had just finished cleaning the ear spools when I was there and we were finishing the reconstruction of the skull, and I thought, oh dear, I'm going to have to spend all night resculpting these ear spools. But it turned out that the director of the museum said, no, just use the real things. And so we put her actual pectoral necklace and her actual ear spools on her for the reconstruction that was done in the museum. Okay, here I am now adding the orbicularis oculi muscles, which go around the eyes and right up around the brow. And as I do this, you'll see that the face is now beginning to sort of come a bit to life. Now, one of the interesting things about her skull is if you look at this part right in here and feel that same bone in you, most of you will have that bone will go way back right in this area right here. And yet in her skull, it comes very substantially forward. It gives her a much flatter face than what most people have. And interestingly, as we compared that with photographs of some of the people who, some women who lived in the 19th century, there was a German anthropologist named Hans Brüning who photographed, used just as photography was coming about in the late 19th century, he photographed some of these women, and we were able to use the photographs as well as looking at other skulls that have been excavated to find that this was an anatomical characteristic that was common in both the modern people who were the descendants of her people, as well as the ancient skulls that were there, having that very kind of a flat face around the eyes because that bone was protruding much farther forward than it is in most people. And that will determine very much what her face looks like. I'm going to put just a few striations in here to suggest the orbiting nature of these muscles. And then the next step that I'm going to do, we've just put in the orbicularis oculi muscles. The next step is I'm going to put in the orbicularis oris muscle, which goes around the mouth. And as I get ready to put in the mouth, one of the things that you'll notice about your mouth if you close your lips and just sort of relax your mouth a bit and then feel about where the parting of the mouth is, you'll notice that it comes up just a little bit above the top of the teeth, about halfway along the top part of the teeth. So as I put in this muscle, I'll design it in such a way that when I add in the lips, they will come up at just about that point. So here is what we call the orbicularis oris muscle going around. That muscle, by the way, tends to form the corners of your mouth from your lips, right over in this area, right in here, and over here is where we'll have the corners of the mouth begin forming. And then attached to those are what are sometimes called the levator muscles, and I'll add just a few of those in. Again, if I were doing this as without the time constraints that we have today, these I'd add in the muscles very carefully and make sure we get each one. What I'll be doing today is just adding in some of the major ones. We call these, they have a number of names associated with them, but just collectively they're called the levator muscles. Levator meaning that they levitate the mouth. These are the muscles that you'll use to smile. And they help to pull the mouth up and pull it wide so that you can then lift it up. And then shortly after that, I'll add in what are called the depressor muscles, which do just the reverse. That's the muscles that we use to frown. And they will help add in much of the shape that we have in the face. And then also in this part of the cheek, what helps to add in some of the bulk in it, and I'll use a slightly different colored clay for this, we have what are called the parotid glands, which are kind of pea glands that are about the size of peas, but they tend to add in some of the bulk of the cheek in here. And so I'll represent those with a little bit of with some of this clay, making sort of pea-sized pieces of the parotid glands. All right, while I do that, let me return a little bit to talking about the priestess and some of the characteristics that we know about her based on what was in her tomb. Anyway, much of the ornamentation that she had, we've talked a little bit about some of those. It was very rich. She had this large pectoral necklace made of beads. There was a second one that was made of pieces of shell, and then a third one that was a series of gold ornaments that went around it. On what were her wrists were some bracelets that were made of gold beads, as well as beads made of shell. And then in her hand, and this was the interesting thing, you could even see the remnants of her fingers wrapped around it, was a long scepter that was made of solid gold. And so extremely rich ornamentation that we find in her tomb. Okay, I'm going to be adding in now some of the depressor muscles that help to fill out the part of the chin. And we're now at the point where we have enough of the muscles in place that I'm going to begin putting in the rest with some skin. I think before we do that, still with the red clay, I'm going to add in her lips. And I mentioned a moment ago that the mouth is going to come up just a little bit above about halfway down along the teeth. And so here I'll begin adding in the lips. And if you think of your upper lip, in fact, both the upper and the lower lip do have some interesting shapes to them. The upper lip, the most vertical part of it is right in the center, and then it gradually goes horizontal as it goes back. And so we'll pull that down here along on this side, coming back toward the corner of the mouth, and then there's a little bit of a divot right in here. And then this part is actually kind of fun. We've got the lips in place, the upper lip in place. Watch how fast her mouth takes shape as we put the lower lip into place here. And you can see very rapidly her mouth now begins to take shape. And the lower lip, like the upper lip, is most horizontal right at the center point, and then it gradually, most vertical at the center point, and then gradually becomes horizontal like that. And the lips actually kind of wrap around the face and then come back in under there, and I mentioned that orbicularis oris muscle comes up around here, gives the lips their corners right in here. And then another thing that I've tried to do in here is a lot of times we kind of think of the lips as that crease between the lips as being flat and going straight across. It's not. It usually is just up a little bit in the corner, goes down, goes up again, down, up, down, up. And so you can see that right here. Here we go a little bit up, down, up, down, up, down, up. And that gives the shape of that crease in the mouth, and having it wrap around the face. Okay, we're now at the point where I can begin putting on some of her skin. The first thing I'm going to do is work on the eyelids. And when we look at the eyelids, I'll put in the lower eyelid first. If you're looking straight ahead, I need to press in here just a little bit to give the depression of the lower eyelid. As you look at the lower eyelid, if your eye is looking straight ahead, it almost looks like the pupil of the eye is rolling along the lower part of that, or the lower part of the pupil of the eye. It looks like a ball rolling along the lower eyelid. So when you're looking straight ahead, typically that pupil will come right along where the lower eyelid is. And then the upper eyelid typically covers about the top third of the eye. And you'll notice as that goes into place that suddenly those eyes, those prosthetic eyes that I've added in there, they look at this one over here, and it looks like it's just staring at you very wide. But once we put the eyelid in here, it now begins to look much more lifelike, with that upper eyelid, the lower eyelid coming in right at the bottom of the pupil, and then the upper eyelid covering the upper third or so of the eye. And here's where her face begins to look. You'll notice how flat it looks, because this part of the face, due to her bones, comes out very far. And then we'll add a little bit of skin up here over the brow, and just a little bit of a fold in the eye that covers the upper part of it right in here. Now, you'll notice that with your eyes, if you close them like this, it looks kind of flat, and then you can feel the edge of the bone, of the orbit up there, with that very thin orbicularis oculi muscle that covers it. But when the eyes are open, this skin right here tends to form a little bit of a fold. So when you open the eyelid, the skin over the top of it will fold over it. And so I'll add in just a little bit of that fold as we go around. And now I'll do the same thing with the other side to give a feel for what her eyes are like. And as I do that, let's return to talking a little bit about what her tomb was like, and what we discovered in it as it was being excavated. And by the way, one of the most exciting parts of my life was to be able to actually go in and do some of the excavations. As we went in and looked at the tomb, they handed me a trowel and a brush, and I was able to uncover some of the pieces of skeleton, as well as some of the artifacts that were there. And one of those, every once in a while in your life, you have one of these just incredible epiphany moments where something something very remarkable happens that you will never forget. And one of those was when I was just very carefully brushing away some of the dirt, and suddenly I saw gold. And here was this beautiful piece of some gold ornamentation that was there as I brushed it away, and I uncovered it a little bit more, and there were some pieces of beads and shell, and brushed away a little bit more, and more gold coming out of it. And few people have that kind of an experience any time in their life to actually discover gold. I was ready to just shout out, "Gold, here it is." And very exciting to be able to be a part of that and do that sort of excavation. But then even more fun to be able to hold in my hands the pieces of her skull and replicate them, and then think for a bit about what her life must have been like. She lived at a time when it was right toward the end of the civilization. We know from a lot of some climatology work that had been done that she lived right near the end, right at about the time that her civilization failed. And the failure from the climatological data was caused by a major El Nino event that caused an enormous drought in the area. And in fact, there's some speculation that there were quite a number of human sacrifices done at that point. The thought being that those sacrifices were to appease the gods and help the rains come, so that they would be able to overcome the lack of food that came about as a result of these droughts. It was pretty clear that her civilization failed shortly after her death, and in all likelihood there was another competing civilization that came into the area and overtook hers. So she was likely, if not the last, one of the last major female rulers of that civilization that lived at that time. And in fact, these El Nino events still occur and cause pretty tremendous climatological change. One of the pyramids that was not far from the one where she was excavated, there was a complex of pyramids, and one of them was, as a modern El Nino event came, there was a drought which was followed by very severe torrential rains. And the torrential rains were so great that this pyramid that had stood for more than 1,000 years was completely wiped out, an adobe pyramid. The river nearby, which was mostly dry, filled up with water and flooded, and within less than a week's time, an entire pyramid was completely washed away. This pyramid that had been around for a long time. And so the Peruvian government, in an attempt to preserve the remaining pyramids that were in that area and keep them from being washed away, looked for a site that was free of artifacts and began digging a canal that would divert the river away from the pyramids. And as they were doing the excavations, even though they suspected that it was a site that was free of burials and artifacts, they came across what turned out to be the largest burial site ever discovered in the area. And they had to abandon the canal and turn what had been the canal into a new excavation site, where they found more than 150 burials along with major artifacts. And that area is still being excavated to this day. All right, I'm ready to put in the nose. And whenever we do these sorts of reconstructions, there are questions about how do you tell what the nose looked like? Well, this aperture that I've just covered with clay gives us an idea of how wide the nose is. But how long do we make it, and what's the angle on it? Well, fortunately, there's a bone right up here on the bridge of the nose that tells us about what the angle was. But then this part below, about 2/3 of the nose, is made of cartilage, and so that cartilage and skin, and so it completely deteriorates. But fortunately, just right underneath the nose right here is a little piece of bone that comes out. You can feel it if you put your finger right up on your upper lip and press up against the nose. You'll feel that bone under there. That's called the nasal spine. And typically the nose comes out to about 3 times the length of the nasal spine. And so that gives us then an idea of what the nose looked like. And then also the fact that Hans Bruning took these photographs of native women in this area, that we can look at them and tell pretty much what the common features of things such as the nose and the lips were like. And so we know that their noses were fairly broad and wide, and the nasal spines her nasal spine was fairly short, which means her nose was somewhat flattened. And so I'll do that as I add it in here. And then I'll carve in the nostrils of her nose. And then sort of round it off around in here. Put in the skin up over the top of it. And bring it around. Now your skin is about 1/4 of an inch thick, and that's about the thickness that I'm making it in here. I'll bring it down, have it cover the lips up in here. And I'm going to leave I'm not going to take this flesh-colored clay and cover the bottom of the lips. Instead, I'll color those in a moment so that they'll look lifelike. And form the corners of the mouth in here. And now you can begin to see that the features of her face are beginning to take shape. Okay, let me take a few moments to talk a little bit more about what we know about her. Again, there were all of this rich ornamentation that we found within her tomb, and then the 5 other skulls of what turned out to be women who were buried with her. One of the things we do know about her civilization is that on these pyramids, the pyramids were purely ceremonial. In fact, there were no burials within the pyramids themselves. The burials were usually nearby. And in her case, one of the pyramids, the pyramid that was closest to her tomb was one that carries the name of Chornankap. Of course, we do not know what her actual name was at the time. She was named Chornankap because that's the modern name of the region and the pyramid where she was found. And so that's the name that she carries now. Well, when her tomb was discovered, it was the most elaborate and richest tomb of a female ruler that had ever been discovered in South America. And so the discovery of this tomb immediately made her very famous. And suddenly, in fact, even during the time that we were there, she was, I guess, even though she was now 800 years old, was suddenly the most popular person in Peru. And when we did the facial reconstruction, it became an immensely popular event. We did the excavations in the summer of 2012. I was able to replicate the skull at that time, bring the replicated fragments of the skull home. Of course, they would not allow me to bring the actual skull home. The fragments were very fragile, and then the Peruvian government will not allow any artifacts to leave the country. Too many of them had left the country long ago and can be found in museums all around the world. In fact, if you go to some of the major art museums in the United States, such as the Metropolitan Museum in New York or the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, you'll find some, as well as some natural history museums, the American Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., as well as the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Go to any of those museums and you will find fragments of skulls, as well as artifacts such as pottery that came from these civilizations, and that were taken from the nation of Peru. And Peru now is very strict about protecting those so that they can remain in the national museums. And so any of the more recent things that are excavated do not leave the country. And so it was critical for me to replicate those pieces of skull, and then I took the replicated parts home to reassemble her features. And then after that was done, we returned in December of 2012 to the museum where we could put the completed reconstruction there. What I did is I took the face, which had been finished, is getting close to where I am now. I had finished everything on the reconstruction itself without putting on the hair or any of the clothing on her. Took that to Peru, and then when we were in Peru, we finished the reconstruction in the laboratories of the museum, where she was then unveiled. And the unveiling was quite a ceremony. We had reporters there from all over the nation of Peru, as well as throughout South America. The BBC came over from England. There were Japanese and Chinese journalists. Unfortunately, no one from the United States took enough interest in it to be there. But from the rest of the world, we had journalists that came from all over to be there for the unveiling. She was unveiled in December of 2012, and then in March of 2012, the exhibit was completed, and with all of the artifacts that were found in the tomb were arranged in displays in the museum, and her reconstructed face with all of the clothing, replica of the crown, and then actually not a replica, but the real pectoral necklace that she was buried with was put on her, as well as the real ear spools. And then the gold pieces that were in her crown were added to fabric, which it was obvious that her crown was made of fabric covered with gold ornamentation. And I've made a construction of that crown that I'll show here shortly, which will add to her face in a moment, so that I've got to check the time here. I can't see the clock on the wall. Looks like we're about 10 minutes from finishing up. And all of these were added with the reconstruction. And then we had this wonderful press conference where all of these people had come together for her unveiling. And as they did, I remember we gave a nice presentation of how this was all done. By the way, there's a nice YouTube video that's present in the museum, which is available for you to see. Just go ahead and put in Priestess Chortlenkop as a Google search and do it for videos, and that video will come up and you can watch the video of this, of both the reconstruction as well as the unveiling ceremony that we had in Peru at the time. And I remember standing there after the unveiling had taken place, and they had a press conference where members of the press were asking questions, and all of it in Spanish. And I remember the museum director was standing next to me, as well as Dr. Klaus, and they were busy answering questions, and I was thinking, this is great, I can just stand here and not have to say anything. And just as I was thinking of that, the museum director said, oh, I think that's a question that Dr. Fairbanks would like to answer. And suddenly about 40 microphones just converged in front of my face. And I had to answer questions about human anatomy in Spanish on national Peruvian television. But fortunately, all went well, and now I can even go to some of the videos that are still posted on the internet of me speaking in Spanish, answering questions about human anatomy. But anyway, there was tremendous interest in it, and she suddenly became a major hero for the nation of Peru. The most famous actress in Peru is named Fabiola de la Cuba, and she was commissioned to play, in fact, she even volunteered, she was so excited about this, to play the part of the priestess of Chortlenkop. And it was remarkable as we looked at the reconstruction of her face. She was a spitting image, Fabiola was a spitting image of the priestess. The two of them look almost identical to each other. And so she was an excellent choice to play this part. They had a major production of her representing the priestess being carried in with ceremonially by a group of men who carried her seated on a throne. And they made a big production and spectacle of it that played for several months after the unveiling at the museum. She is right now, her reconstructed skull is in the museum on display. It will be there through December of this year, after which it will go to, she'll travel to Europe, where the archaeological museums in France are going to display her over the 2015 calendar year. I'm hoping I'll have the chance to travel to France to be able to see some of these exhibits that they have of her. And the National Geographic magazine has done a short article about her and displayed her scepter. They're now talking about doing a major article about her that will hopefully appear within about a year, that will give a lot of the details of her life. She's one of the few famous female rulers ever discovered that was as rich and elaborate as her tomb is. So a major kind of unusual discovery for any ruler. All right, let's turn back a little bit to the face. You can see I'm just filling in now the remaining parts of her skin. One of the things I'm going to add in now is, as soon as I get the cheek filled in, we'll add in just some quickly sketched in ears, and then we'll start putting some of the coloration in on her lips. Now for the ears, of course, there's no good way to, her ears, of course, would have deteriorated away, but we can get a fairly good idea of where her ears were by the apertures that were present in the skull, where the hearing part of your ear is located. And then also in one of the ways that we can tell where the ears are is that if you look at your ears, this isn't true for everyone, but the basic structures of the ears are such that the top of the ear usually is about the same position as as where your eyebrows are. So if you look at my eyebrows, come straight across here, you'll see there's the top of the ear, and then the bottom of the ear is about the same place as the bottom of the nose. And so that's how I'll add in her ears, and because we're going to cover them up with her hair, I won't take the time to put in all of the detail of her ears. We'll just give them a basic shape right here. And that will help to fill in some of the bulk of her face. And then one of the last things I'm going to do before we put on her hair and a few of the other things is I'm going to just smooth out her skin so that it looks a little more lifelike. And I'm using a sculpture tool here that has some striations in it, and the striations give us a way of making things a bit more smooth as we go along. Carve in just a little under her nose right here. And then I'll smooth those out a little bit with my thumb as we go around. And now, as we get toward the end, the next step that I'm going to do is color in her lips. And as we look at people who are native to the region, the lips are a bit dark, and so what I'm using here is eyeshadow that I purchased at a grocery store. In fact, I wonder if the clerks, as I go in buying eyeshadow, wonder what's this man doing here buying eyeshadow. In fact, when I purchased her wig, the clerk at the store wondered what I was doing with asked what I was doing with the wig, and I explained it, and she said, "No one has ever given me that kind of a story before about what we're doing." In fact, we'll use the eyeshadow here for what it's normally intended to do. Put a little bit up on here. And then as I purchased the eyeshadow, there was one other thing that I was purchasing with them, which is some false eyelashes, which we'll now add in. To make her look a bit more lifelike. And now I'm going to do something, whoops, eyelash just fell off. Now I'm going to do something that's going to look a bit strange, and we're just about finished with her here. I'm going to essentially take her head off. Looks a little bit odd, sorry about that. And we're going to switch things here for a moment. Pull up. And this is what is really going to look strange, is as I put in her head, we'll need to screw it in here a bit. Sorry about that. We don't want it to fall off. I think one more turn should do it. There's her face in there. We'll just very quickly add in the neck. We have a beaded necklace. This represents the pectoral necklace that she wore when she was buried. Add in a little bit of the neck here. Her hair. And what we, of course, there's no way to know from her excavation what her hair actually looked like, but there was a very interesting way that we were able to have a pretty good idea. And that is that the pottery that is there, much of the pottery that's in this area has facial features of the people, and in her case, or in the case of the women, it's quite obvious that they had that the hair was long. It was usually braided. I'm not going to take the time to braid it here. We'll squeeze in her. I'm going to use the clay to hold those in place. Put in her ear spools. And we also know from the pottery that the women wore bangs, that their hair was then braided. And in her case, she wore a very elaborate crown made of fabric with gold ornamentation on it. And there we have a very quick hour-long sketch of the priestess of Chortnan-Kops. And sorry, it looks like I went 4 minutes over time.
Dan, if you could sculpt that a little quicker next time, that'd be great. Holy cow. Before we give Dan one more round of applause, let me just echo what he said. Invite you to Google or YouTube. Now again, some people were whispering, how do you spell the priestess of?
Chortnan-Kops, C-H-O-R-N-A-N-C-A-P.
I'm sure if you just
and
put
if you're writing that
priestess
down,
Chortnan-
I'll say it again. C-H-O-R, let's see, N-A-N-C-A-P. And if you want, you can just put in Priestess Daniel Fairbanks,
That'll work.
Hagen Klaus, and that'll probably come up as well. And you'll probably find it.
When we're done here, feel free to come on up and take a closer look, come up onto the stage and take a closer look and chat with Dan. But folks, please join me in thanking Dan Fairbanks for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks.